So let's talk about the value axis. Now for the Scatter Pro visual, there's going to be two different value axes, one for X and one for Y. The way on how you customize them is if you go under the formatting options, you're first going to notice there's just a single tab called value axis. And if you open it up, there's going to be an additional property called configure axis separately. Now, the reason why we have this is because we give you the control on how you want to essentially format them, whether together or separately. And once you enable this, there's going to be two new tabs added at the bottom right here. So you can see we can configure them separately. Now, some of the things that you can configure here are, for example, the location. So by default, it's going to be on the bottom left corner. That's the default approach, but you can also change its position. And one unique option here is called 0. So for example, if we keep it on the bottom left corner, the way that it works is whenever I move around the scatter plot, you can see that the value axis is always sort of locked in that position. Now, if we switch it to 0, what's going to happen is the values are going to stick to the actual value line. So if I move around, you can see it's going to dynamically change its position based on where I am on the canvas of the visual. Now, a few other things that you can, of course, customize here are things like inverting axis, customizing labels, adjusting the font families, the colors, titles. On top of that, we also have grids. So for example, if I switch it back to bottom left, let's say, so it's sort of in the default position, then we have grids, which are enabled by default, but they're configured in a way so they're not very noticeable. You can still see them, but they're not, jumping out there. But you have additional controls for them. So for example, you can also adjust the axis colors. And for the grid, the same. You can also change the grid colors. So for example, if I want to emphasize on the grid itself a bit more, I could make it, for example, in a black color. The opacity I'm going to increase to something like 20%. I can also say that, hey, I want these to be, 20%. There we go. I'm also going to increase, for example, the spacing. The spacing actually means how it's trying to scale between the two different axes. So by adjusting this, you also define how they're relatively going to be scaling to each other. You can, of course, also adjust the arrow size. By default, it's going to be sitting on 5, and these are these little arrows right here for both of the axes. If it's something that you don't need, you can simply put a 0 there, and the arrows are going to disappear. So it's easily configurable as well. On top of that, titles, font sizes, families for the titles, and so forth. Now, one more important thing regarding the value axis is you need to remember that since these are numerical values by default, if you are using a percentage as a value for one of the value axes, you need to switch this value type to percentage. If they're all together, like if you're configuring both of them, remember that this is going to apply to both of them simultaneously. So if one of them is a numeric one and the other one is a percentage, make sure you make a difference there. The other thing is display units. So whether or not you're using some sort of shortening, and value decimals is also a setting that's going to change based on the value type. So if it's going to be numeric, you're going to see value decimals. If I switch this to percentages, you can see that's going to be percentage decimals. So that all works together and kind of allows you to adjust it even more. On top of that, certain cases also require different solutions. So for example, if those values are not just going to be, dollars or units or something like that, but for example, something like meters squared or something like that, you can easily also enable value affixes, and you can add your own custom prefix or a suffix. That's going to allow you to customize this even more. And the last thing that we have here is a crosshair. So once you enable it, hovering over the chart, you can see it gives me a crosshair option, which allows me to have a better reference line as to what exactly or where exactly I'm located on the X and Y coordinates. You can adjust the crosshair as well, the color, the opacity, the thickness of the lines, and so forth. So for value axis, that's going to be it.